yes, introduce myself a bit, but I'll introduce myself properly. My name is Clint Parker. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. For the past almost year now, I've been in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, doing field work on Shughni, and also making sort of connections here, writing my dissertation, lots of things. And here in Dushanbe, I'm affiliated with the Tajik National Academy of Sciences. So the title of today's talk is Selected Topics in Shughni Grammar, Information Structure, Oblique-first Constructions, and Irregular Verbs. So it's just sort of a hodgepodge of different things from my dissertation. None of them necessarily very connected to the other, but if anyone finds anything interesting, I'm happy to send sections of my dissertation on. So as I said, the data from this talk comes almost exclusively from my dissertation titled A Grammar of the Shughni Language, and it is exactly that. It's a descriptive grammar of Shughni. It employs as theoretically neutral an approach as possible, and it's almost finished. So hopefully within the next 3 or 4 months, I'll be able to get it out completely. There's 3 primary aims of the dissertation, I would say, sort of fundamental goals. The first is to synthesize previous research on Shughni. And here I've focused primarily on Soviet-era Russian language publications. I've found these to be extremely helpful, have a lot of information in them. But before I really started researching Shughni, they weren't so accessible to me until I sort of started working on my Russian. And I know a lot of English language scholars based in North America would have the same feeling. So this was sort of one thing that I really focused on in the dissertation. Of course, I also attempt to build upon these same publications in providing, again, a theory-neutral description of underdescribed and undescribed areas of Shughni grammar. And lastly, to point out issues and puzzles for future research. And in this way, I hope that the dissertation proves to be a kind of idea bank for future research on the language. And I'll try and do each of these things in today's talk as well. So the roadmap for today, first, I'll give just an overview of the dissertation. I'll talk about each section, and I'll talk about some highlights within each section. It's going to be a lot. I'll give you a heads up. I'm going to be throwing some information there. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to, or I won't be able to talk about everything that I wanted to talk about today just for time constraints. But I have included some slides at the end in sort of an appendix looking at different topics that I won't be able to get to. So you can actually go ahead and look at those if you'd like. And if we have time at the end, I'm happy to look at any of those as well. The second thing I'll talk about is the expression of focus in Shughni. So this is one piece of information structure that I'd like to talk about. Then oblique-first constructions. In some circles, these might be known as impersonal constructions. And then lastly, the phenomenon of verb shortening. So I'll go ahead and get started with the dissertation overview and highlights. And here, I'll just go ahead and say that anything that's in red indicates that this is something that I won't be talking about in the main part of the talk, but I've included in slides at the end. So there's 4 sections in the dissertation. The first one is on preliminaries, and it includes, among other things, the genealogical classification of Shughni. And one thing that I sort of harp on here is the idea that the Pamir languages are best thought of as a Sprachbund within the Iranian branch of Indo-European, and that they have not been demonstrated to constitute a distinct genetic subgroup within Iranian. This is sort of a pet peeve of mine. I seem to see in a lot of publications either language surrounding this or else some kind of figure that seems to imply that the Pamir languages are a distinct genetic subgroup, but to my knowledge, they haven't been demonstrated to be such, and maybe won't be. So in any case, there are 4 genetic subgroups within Pamir. These are the Ishkashimi Sanglechi group, the Wahi group, the Munji-Yīdow group, and the North Pamir group, which includes the Shughni languages and the Yāskulani. And much of this, of course, is due to Valentina Sokolova in her 1967 and 73 works on genetic relations, and also Antje Wimpelen's 2009 article is a good summary of this. I do look at phonology. There's a chapter on phonology in the dissertation. I provide some acoustic data on vowel quality and length. Much of this corroborates Sokolova 1953, and it also seems to corroborate the work that's come out of the HSE field trips that I've seen a bit of. I provide a discussion of some of the morphophonological vowel groupings between short and long vowels, and this is something that I'll actually get into later in the talk today. I also discussed some orthography issues, and I know there's been a talk on orthography in this seminar, and likely we touch upon many of the same issues. One thing that I've included, I think 2 or 3 slides on in the appendix here, is an issue with the Arabic script, and in particular how to represent the phonemes th and the in native Shughni words. Of course, Arabic has these phonemes as well, has special letters for them. But in Arabic borrowings that have come into Shughni, likely via Persian, these Arabic phonemes are pronounced sa and za in Shughni. So the question becomes, do we keep the same letters for the Arabic script to represent Shughni tha and za, or do we have completely new letters? And there's a couple different schools of thought on this, and I have a couple citations in there. And again, the red text means there's some slides at the end. So the second section of the dissertation looks at nominals. I look, for instance, at content and reference of noun phrases. For instance, the use of bare nouns with generic, indefinite, and definite reference, which it seems they can have all of these types of reference depending on context. I look at grammatical gender in nominals, agreement and concord patterns. Perhaps my favorite topic actually in the whole dissertation is on gender assignment. I look at the various factors which modulate it, phonological factors, historical factors, and semantic factors. And these, of course, are the same sort of semantic factors that Professor Plungyan alluded to last week in his talk on the Hindu Kush linguistic area. And it's really intriguing to see the same kinds of semantic factors at play in the nominal classification systems of Dravidian, say, and Burushevsky and other unrelated languages. In this section of the dissertation, I also point to the gender of Russian borrowings as a potentially fruitful area for future research on Shughni gender assignment. It seems that gender assignment to Russian borrowings also falls along these same kind of semantic lines, and actually that some of the semantic factors that are sort of backgrounded in native Shughni words come out quite a bit in Russian borrowing. So for instance, the factor of a whole, the concept of a whole versus a part, where the whole is typically feminine and the part is masculine. This seems to come up a lot, particularly in technological borrowings. So I think this is a potentially sort of interesting route to go for future research on gender. And of course, much of what I say comes from or is corroborated by Karamshoyev's 2-volume work on gender. I also look at demonstrative pronouns and other deictic elements like deictic adverbs and presentatives, being like yama, yada, and yowo, potentially yowa. And I look also at factors modulating the choice of demonstrative degree. So whether a speaker chooses to use a proximal, medial, or distal form. And in Shughni, of course, the medial form is fundamentally addressee oriented, meaning that if the referent is within the personal space of the addressee, a medial form is likely to be used. But there seem to be other situations in which a medial form is used which don't necessarily correspond to that, and that has been an interesting topic to investigate. And I've got a few slides on that as well. So you'll see here in the slide on the verbs section that I wanted to include a whole lot of things. I was very ambitious in what I thought I could include in this talk. Unfortunately, most of it had to go. but I did include some slides at the end. So I talk about regular and irregular verbs. I try to give sort of a more formal definition or a more precise definition of what constitutes a regular and an irregular verb in Shughni. I talk about the kinds of historical factors that have led to many of the vowel and consonant irregularities. Much of this comes, of course, from Sokolova 1967 and Dodykhudoeva 1988. For instance, stem ablaut, the vowel ablaut in between usually present stems and past imperfect stems. So take a present stem like xār, and its past stem khud, meaning eat. And then consonant irregularities like wirafts and wiruvd, which means to stand, where many of these things are have come about via either regular sound change or once productive suffixes that that targeted only present stems and not other stems. I also talk about the historical perfect plural forms, which Karamshoyev goes into. So the idea that a verb like sīdow, which now has sits, which is used for both feminine and plural, and soj for masculine, actually once had a perfect plural form, savj. Other irregularities in verbs, things like verb stem shortening. So take a verb like xārein. Typically, we don't see that. We see geen instead. And this is something that I will be talking about later in the talk today. I look at hybrid complex verbs, which is a term that I use for verbs like dāktow and lāktow, which also have the forms dākchīdow and lākchīdow, and sort of build upon an idea that was expressed to me by Dr. Plungyan about kind of a decline in complexity when it comes to Shughni verbs. I talk about the leveling of stem paradigms. This was also something looked at by Dodykhudoeva in 1988 quite a bit. I look at issues in TAM. I attempt to provide a description of the factual enclitic ta, but spoiler alert here, this is a tough one. I don't think I really have anything super insightful to say about it, other than it's tough and something to be looked at in the future. I do try to point to some sort of aspectual and temporal distinctions that it can be used to encode. I look at the temporal and aspectual compatibilities of each verb stem, mood and evidentiality, various issues in transitivity like reflexive verbs. So is-čīdow versus is-ho-čīdow, and the way that ho patterns in reflexive verbs, various types of the passive, so the dynamic with the suffix ak, as in renuhchak sot, and then the adjectival passive and in, as in renuhchin, morphological and syntactic causatives and their differences in semantics, and oblique-first constructions, which I'll talk about later. Moving on to the last section, this is one chapter looking at various phenomena in syntax, including complex sentences, temporal adverbial clauses, indirect speech, and 3 different types of relative clauses that I've been able to identify in Shughni. One of them is correlative clauses, which is a subtype of internally headed relative clause. And this is particularly interesting, again, in light of last week's talk. It seems like correlative clauses may be another sort of aerial feature shared by other languages of the region with Shughni, including Indo-Aryan. There's some citations in the back for correlative clauses in Hindi, and also Wahi seems to have correlative clauses as well, something that is in Bashir's 2009 description of Wahi. I look at information structure here, the expression of topic, which I won't get to today, and the expression of focus, which I will, and then question formation, including kind of word order in questions, as well as different question particles, including those used for echo questions. Echo questions being something like you said what, or you went where. And Shughni has 2 different particles for echo questions that I've seen. One of them is used for WH echo questions. That's the particle ik, as in zik. And then there's a particle a used for polar echo questions, as in tonana, meaning I think that you said your mother, right? Something like that. So that's that's the overview of the dissertation. I know it was a lot, so to give myself a bit of a breather, I'll go ahead and see if there's any questions here, anything that could be answered kind of quickly before we move on. Moving on to the expression of focus. So this is the one piece of information structure that I can get to today. I'll start off by just sort of giving a rundown of what neutral word order in Shughni looks like. So Shughni has SOV word order. This is what it looks like. And in between our S's and O's and V's, we have sort of a precise ordering of adverbs, you could say. So adverbs of frequency generally precede adverbs of time, which precede both objects. And then adverbs of manner tend to come right before the verb. SOV order occurs in discourse neutral contexts, for instance, in response to the question cheese gap, what happened, where at least in theory, the entire response should constitute new information and there's no subpart of the response that's focused. So here's an example of this. And for this example and others later in this section, I'll be using context because context is particularly important in establishing which part of an utterance is focused. So this context sets up a discourse neutral situation. So the speaker and addressee are sitting at the addressee's house. A group of men approaches and the speaker, not anticipating the arrival of the men, asks the addressee what's happening. And the response is, these men are going to buy my car today. And we can see our SOV order. And we can see that this temporal adverb nor is right here in between the S and the O, as it likes to be in its neutral world. As I understand it, any deviations from this word order in this situation, particularly if you try to put the O before the S, or if you try to put the V before the S, are going to result in infelicitous sentences in this context. But of course, we know that word order in Shughni is flexible. We know that scrambling is common. If you hear the language spoken, it jumps out. And it seems that in a lot of ways, non-canonical word order often is used to express nuances precisely in information structure. So let's look at one of these notions in information structure, focus. So I'll start off with just sort of a bit of background on focus, just so that we're on the same page in terms of what I take this to be. I take focus to be the part of an utterance which contributes new information to the discourse context, and the discourse context being the set of presuppositions shared between interlocutors. This, of course, is quite an informal definition, so here's a reference for something a little bit more in depth. And focus stands in contrast to background, which is the older presupposed information contained in an utterance. And importantly, focus can be either contrastive or non-contrastive. And in contrastive focus, the focused constituent or the focused element is selected among a contextually salient and usually small subset of alternatives. And on the other hand, a focused element, which is not contrastive, is not selected from such a subset. So let's look at a couple examples that illustrate this. These are both from English. So again, our context is important here, and it's established with Speaker A's question. So Speaker A says, "Where is Kazakhstan located?" And Speaker B says, "Kazakhstan is located in Central Asia." So the background of Speaker B's response are these sort of presuppositions that Kazakhstan is a place and that it's located somewhere. And then our focus is this new piece of information that's been contributed. So this is an instance of non-contrastive focus. Contrastive focus, which comes in several subtypes, is shown in 4. This is the corrective subtype of focus. And here again, we have our context. So Speaker A says, Kazakhstan is located in South Asia. And Speaker B, knowing this to be incorrect, says, no, Kazakhstan is located in Central Asia. And here, you can also hear that the sentential prosodic prominence falls precisely on this focused element here. And it actually falls on this element as well, although they're potentially 2 different intonation patterns. And it seems that in Shughni, as in English, the focused element of an utterance also receives prosodic prominence. So let's look at how focus interacts with word order specifically. So one observation is that it seems that focused elements which are non-contrastive obligatorily remain in situ. Perhaps obligatorily is a bit strong at this point, but it seems that they do tend to remain in situ. In other words, scrambling doesn't occur in order to express non-contrastively focused elements. On the other hand, contrastively focused elements are optionally fronted, although not obligatorily. And as I just mentioned, it does seem that sentence level prosodic prominence occurs on the focused constituent. So let's look at a few examples of this. Again, the first observation is that non-contrastively focused elements tend to, or maybe always, appear in situ. So let's start with the context. Nekruza's sister arrives home and she's hungry. She doesn't know what to eat and she asks her mother what Nekruz ate. So she might say something like, Nekruza čīdow. And in response to this, a perfectly viable answer might be something like Nekruza lapshahud. Here we have our canonical SOV word order, and here, right here is our non-contrastively focused element. An infelicitous word order for this would be if we try to front the non-contrastively focused element. So here, if we try to say lapshai nekruzhud, or even lapshai nekruzhud, that would not be good in this context. Certainly it would be good in other contexts, but not this one. So this is our first example of non-contrastive focus not being felicitous if it's fronted to clause initial position. Let's do one more example of this. So here's another context. Nekruza's father has been concerned that Nekruz is falling behind on his homework. And while walking around the house, he notices Nekruz's completed homework lying on the table. So he's pleasantly surprised. And he asks Nekruz's mother about when the homework was done. So he might have said something like, Nekruz tsawach podarshet. And a perfectly viable response to this would be Nekruz biyor podarshet. And again, here, our temporal adverb biyor, meaning yesterday, is right there in between the subject and the object, as it likes to be. And an infelicitous word order for this context would be biyor nekruz khodarshet. And again, here, this word order might be perfectly fine, would be perfectly fine in other contexts, but in this context, which has established non-contrastive focus, it's not okay if it's fronted. Okay, so let's move on to contrastive focus. The second observation is that contrastively focused elements are optionally fronted. Let's take another example here in another context. Sator and Mirzo are telling a story to Karim. Both Sator and Mirzo are familiar with the story, which is about Andrei. However, as Sator begins to tell the story, he mixes up a few details and is subsequently corrected by Mirzo. So Sator might have said something like, Andrei biyor homoshin pardod. Andrei sold his car yesterday. One way that Mirzo could correct him is simply by leaving this contrastively focused element in situ. So he could say something like, Nai Andrei ashib homoshin pardod. So Andrei sold his car actually the day before yesterday. But he also has the option in this case to front this contrastively focused element. So here, Nai ashibe Andrei homoshin pardod is also okay. But it's, of course, not the case that you can just move things around sort of willy-nilly at will. So there are a couple of, here I've shown just a couple of infelicitous word orders for this context. So if you try to front the verb in this context, or if you try to front the object in this context, it results in an infelicitous sentence because these are not the contrastively focused elements. One more observation on focus and Shughni, and this is that the fronting of verbs is often used to indicate corrective focus on polarity. But again, corrective focus on polarity may also remain in situ. So last context, I think. A group of friends have just had dinner at a restaurant and they decide to pay individually. That is, each one decides to pay for what they ordered. So one of them takes the bill and starts making calculations out loud. And one of the friends disagrees and makes some corrections. So we might start with something like blah, 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 gulnozaye pizza hud, and gulnoza ate pizza. And one way that this could be corrected is simply by leaving the verb in place. So someone could say, nai gulnozaye pizza nahud. Alternatively, they could front the verb in this situation and say, nahud gulnoza pizza. And I'm told that both of these options are perfectly fine. And again, you can hear the corrective focus sort of intonation pattern in both of these instances. So just to sum up, focus here, we saw that focus constituents, which are not contrastive, seem to be obligatorily in C2. So scrambling does not occur in these cases. Contrastively focused elements, on the other hand, are optionally fronted. And we saw that prosodic prominence occurs generally always on the focused constituent. There are obviously many things left to be researched here. One thing is that, in my ear anyway, it seems that there are at least two different types of intonation patterns, possibly one of which is only compatible with contrastive focus. And of course, again, these observations in general, but especially the ones on prosodic prominence, are quite vague and need further examination. And then, of course, interface of prosody and expression of topic is also ripe for investigation. Okay, that's all I had on focus. Does anyone, would anyone like to ask any questions on focus, kind of while it's fresh on our mind before moving on? Okay, so now switching gears once more. And moving to a type of construction that I call oblique-first constructions, which also do sort of tangentially, maybe not so tangentially, touch word order. So oblique-first constructions in Shughni are essentially a heterogeneous set of constructions where in neutral word order, the oblique argument comes before the direct argument. And semantically, as they often are cross-linguistically, these are often psych predicates in Shughni, so predicates which express psychological states such as liking or wanting. And in some cases, they may also express physical states or changes of states. And we'll see in a second that this might be associated more so with accusative first rather than dative first construction. And syntactically, it's noteworthy that it seems to me that the verbal agreement always takes place with the direct argument. I have yet to see any exception to this. And so basically, this is what an oblique-first construction looks like. So you have an experiencer-like argument in an oblique case, or in the oblique case, sometimes with a dative suffix as well. And that's followed in neutral word order by your nominative or direct argument, and then verbal agreement takes place with this theme-like direct argument. In Shughni, these oblique-first constructions are similar in many ways to impersonal constructions found in European languages that are more familiar to me. German, for example, mich fröstelt, I'm shaking, or mir ist schlecht, I feel sick. These are very similar to what we see in Shughni. But in the literature, there seems to be a disagreement on what constitutes an impersonal construction. That seems to be something of a loaded term. So in the dissertation, I've chosen to use for Shughni a more descriptively precise term, oblique first. So in this section, we'll look at accusative first constructions and then dative first constructions, and then we'll talk about some issues at the intersection of oblique first constructions and subjecthood. So accusative first constructions would be a subtype of oblique first construction where the first argument is just a bare oblique argument, that is one without a dative suffix ard or ra. So in general, it seems to me that there are fewer of these than dative first, and that they might be more likely to denote a physical state such as sleeping or shivering. So here are a few examples. yīdow. So if you say yes, that means I'm falling asleep. Čīdow, to shiver. Kisht means I'm shivering. Thank you for this correction on not I'm shaking. Yes. So right. So čīdow in any case means to shiver in Shughni. Yāntow to catch a cold. And then yīdow, which is sort of an interesting case. This may not be an accusative first construction proper, but rather an instance of the inversion of a possessor and a preposition. So ba, assuming it's a preposition, maybe from Tajik, meaning to. So this literally would mean to memory fall. But if you say, I remember, you would say mo yīdow and not ba mo yīdow. And this is something that we see in other prepositional constructions. For instance, you would say mon téléphone mo medost instead of me modost. So this might be what we're dealing with in this kind of construction. This, to my knowledge, is an exhaustive list. Obviously, there are likely many more that I'm not aware of, but in general, again, it seems that these are comparatively fewer than dative first. So here are a couple examples. In 10, Samira kasal savad wanted to shave chud. When Samira was sick, she shivered very badly. And in 11, I'm sleepy, but I have a lot of work. And here, again, this is neutral word order. So in this clause, the accusative wam comes first, and then we have our sort of nominal-like piece here, and same here, khudum meaning to sleep. So dative first constructions are those which have an oblique argument and a dative suffix, ard or ra. Again, they seem to be quite a bit more common than accusative first. They're somewhat more semantically and syntactically diverse. So they may be built on a non-copular verb, either a simplex verb like photo, which means to be desirous to, which is used in constructions that would translate to want in English, or else they may be built on a complex verb like čīdow, to feel warm, or on a copula together with a nonverbal element, generally a noun or an adjective. So here are some examples of these dative first constructions built on non-copular verbs, verb like photo, čīdow, čīdow, and čīdow. To seem beautiful too. So here are a few examples. And here we have our dative argument first, and then our direct argument. And note that we have third plural agreement with direct argument here, those exam questions. In 13, we have an example with photo with a nominal theme. So where this gabiro came na foreign. And again, here we have third plural agreement that's with the word for pants, which is plural, as opposed to with the dative argument, which is singular. And lastly, we have photo with an infinitival theme and something like monanat kino čīdow fort. So my mom wants to watch a movie where the theme here is this infinitival construction kino čīdow. And again, we have agreement with the infinitival third singular. Here are some more examples of dative first constructions. So shomak yīdow means something like to feel lazy to do something. Shunchak yīdow, to feel like laughing. And again, this would be something like mord shunchak or mord shomak. Niujak, to feel like crying. Khosh is perhaps the most common one here, meaning to like, mord khosh. Berawut, to feel uncomfortable, and dāktow, to need something, also very common. So here are a few examples of dative first constructions with the copula, something like mord berawut chabdost katinevishto. It's uncomfortable for me to write with my left hand. And ostanasam mord shomak megarmende nashtido. I'm not going out. I'm so lazy to go out in this heat. That is something that will probably be said in Dushanbe very shortly. So there are several fundamental questions regarding subjecthood that are raised in light of these constructions. First of all, is it the oblique argument that's a subject in these constructions? Are the direct arguments the subject? Is there such thing as a true subject in these constructions? And of course, we can allow for the possibility that different oblique-first constructions behave differently in this regard, because we've seen that they are rather semantically and syntactically diverse. So it is very much conceivable that they behave differently with respect to subjecthood. And we've already seen one sort of potentially important piece of evidence that verbal agreement is always with the direct argument and not with the oblique argument. But what about other subjecthood tests? So as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been much work on this for Shughni. Perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps I'm missing something. But I'm not aware of any sort of well-accepted subjecthood tests for Shughni. I'd like to point to one potential one though, which is the oblique anaphor kho, which appears to be subject-oriented. And I'll just show a couple of examples demonstrating this subject orientation. So for example, ozum tod čīdow, here I think it might be uncontroversial that was is the subject of this sentence, and ho can only be co-indexed with was and not with to. So I showed you Self's Savoy house. And in B, davlat and nekruzart čīdow, same thing. Again, ho must be co-indexed with davlat as the subject and not with the dative argument nekruz. So this is sort of preliminary observations that ho is a subject-oriented oblique pronoun. So we see that in oblique-first constructions without infinitival complements, ho cannot be co-indexed with the dative argument. So if you try to say something like tord ho choi forto, this is bad. You must say something like tord to choi forto, where you use the possessive pronoun, the oblique personal pronoun. Same thing here. Sayurara wam now moshin this hosh is okay, but sayurara ho now moshin this hosh is not okay. And here, interestingly, we have ambiguity between whether wam refers to sayura or to someone else. And this is a type of ambiguity that's often taken care of precisely by the existence of ho. But in cases like this in dative constructions, this ambiguity can arise and does. And then one last one with an accusative first construction, bade modarsta mohudnjest is okay, bade chodarsta mohudnjest is not okay, meaning after a class I will get sleepy. And again here we have an accusative element here, and ho is not allowed to be co-indexed to it. But a personal pronoun is fine in this instance. Interestingly, it seems like in oblique-first constructions that have an infinitival complement, ho is actually interchangeable with the corresponding personal pronoun within the infinitival complement. So here are a few examples of this. If we want to say we want to see our fathers, it would be something like either mashad mashtaten yāntow fort, where using mash is perfectly fine, or else mashad chotaten yāntow fort, where we can actually use the oblique subject-oriented anaphor here. Same thing in this one, wamar tar wam chīd nisto hosh, and wamar tar hochid nisto hosh is also fine. So sort of the question that comes up is, what does this data tell us? Is it telling us something about the dative argument or about the pronoun ho, or else maybe something about infinitival complements? And I don't have a whole lot to say about this yet, but I think it probably is the last one here, because you can also say something like chodar sheidoard, meaning I need to study my own homework. I need to do my own homework, something like this. But this kind of data is something I would like to explore more in the future. So just to summarize real quick, this section, so despite being in first position in neutral word order, it seems that the oblique argument of oblique first construction really doesn't display other properties associated with subjects. So for instance, it doesn't have the ability to control verbal agreement, and it doesn't have the ability to be co-indexed with the subject-oriented anaphor ho, except possibly in infinitival complements. But this is obviously a fairly short list of subjecthood diagnostics. And again, I'm not aware of any other ones, but it's something to be worked on in the future. And in particular, the questions to be answered would be, what are the defining properties of subjects in Shughni? Are there such things as quirky subjects in Shughni, as I know there are in other languages of the area? And do different kinds of oblique-first constructions behave differently with respect to the subject status of their oblique argument? And then I actually also wonder how often ho in natural speech occurs inside the infinitival complement of an oblique-first construction. And this is something where I think a corpus of naturally occurring speech would help to test this. These examples come from elicited data, but they do, I have had them confirmed by multiple speakers. So it does seem like whether or not to use ho or a personal pronoun inside of the infinitival complement sort of creates a conundrum. And then of course, what about this same type of construction in other Pamir languages? Okay, so the last topic that I want to discuss is this phenomenon of verb shortening. And I will connect it at the end of the section to some things in phonology, in particular, sort of some traditional groupings of vowel phonemes in Shughni into short and long groups. And I'll start off here with a look at what I take to be a regular verb and an irregular verb. So a regular verb is a verb that follows one of the patterns in 22 and 23. So depending also on what the final sound of the present stem would be. So if you look in 22, if a verb's present stem ends in a voiceless consonant or a liquid or a nasal, then its paradigm looks like this. So you have a present stem, and the past stem would be identical to the present stem with the addition of a ta, the infinitive identical to the past stem, and then the perfect stem with a cha at the end in place of the ta. And an example of a verb like this would be benestow, with present stem benest, past stem benest, infinitive identical to that, benest, and then perfect benest, meaning to lose something. And then if a verb's final sound in the present stem ends in a vowel or a semi-vowel or a voiced obstruent, we get the pattern in 23. So basically, instead of da and instead of ta and cha, we have the voiced counterparts of those sounds. So in qiu, which means to call, we get qiud as a past stem, the same as an infinitive stem, and qiuj as a perfect stem. And so a regular verb, as far as I have it, is a verb that follows one of these two patterns, and then any irregular verb would be one that doesn't follow one of the patterns in 22 or 23. So what kinds of verbs tend to be regular in Shughni? So for one thing, borrowings from Persian seem to be regular. Verbs like yāntow, which of course is ultimately of Arabic origin, compare, whoops, the Tajik is not in here for some reason. Compare fahmidan from Tajik, nivishto, to write, compare nivishtan, and forto, which we just talked about, compare Tajik foridan. Also, morphological causatives, both ablaut causatives and suffix causatives tend to be regular. So verbs like fidepto from fidipto with present stem fidap is a regular verb, as is hambento from chavdo, and warvento from wirvdo. Onomatopoeic verbs, except that some of them can agree in gender, tend to be regular. So verbs like kurto, which I guess is sort of the sound of rummaging, dāktow to make a bang, and bulhdo to buzz. These are all also regular verbs. And finally, verbs which were formerly irregular, but whose stem paradigm has been leveled. So one example of this is the verb dāktow, which formerly apparently had, and maybe in for some speakers and in some dialects, also has an infinitive yīdow a present stem dāktow, and a past stem yīdow. So we can see that the leveling here was based on the present stem. Another example of this would be a verb whose infinitive was formerly yīdow, meaning to grind or to mill, with present stem yān, and now has the infinitive yāntow. And both of these come from Dodykhudoeva, 1988. I should have mentioned that here. So how can a verb be irregular? Well, in a variety of different ways. First of all, in suppletion in stem vowels due to regular sound change. So for example, in var, which is the present stem of the verb meaning bring, and then vud, it's past stem. And then consonant irregularities across stems, which I think I mentioned earlier. Also, something like zine, where we have an extra n for the present stem of kill, which has past stem zid. Also, I consider hybrid complex verbs, things like dāktow and lāktow, to be irregular in some sense. And then also the topic for now, via stem shortening. So if we have a present form, present inflected form like zār-um, we see instead zem, which I also take to be a form of irregularity. So which types of verbs undergo shortening of this kind? I'll talk today about shortening of past stems, shortening of inflected present stems, which seems to target only first singular, second plural, and third plural. And then the shortening of second singular imperative stems, which are identical to a bare present stem. And again, I'll show at the end of this section that verb shortening, in particular the shortening of past stems and imperative stems, seems to provide nice morphophonological evidence for traditional classification of Shughni vowels into series of short and long, which is something that has typically only had acoustic evidence and articulatory evidence in the past. So starting off with the shortening of past stems, this is an optional type of shortening, meaning that it seems to occur only part of the time. Maybe it's associated with fast speech as opposed to careful speech. Certainly in my fieldwork, I've heard it plenty of times, and I've heard the full version of the stem in this type of verb many times as well. So this type of shortening targets a verb with the stem final shape consonant and then long u and then d. C here, of course, meaning consonant. And here the final da of the stem is dropped and the long u becomes short o. So we take a stem of the shape consonant u de, like hud, targets this portion of the stem, and we end up with kha, which means to eat. So you could say ozum hud or ozum kha. And here is a list of more verbs that undergo the same type of shortening. So chud to cha, meaning did, vud to va, meaning bring, zedud to zedah, meaning sweep, virud to vira, find, and nishpud to nishpa, to step on. So it does seem to be something about this kind of final shape in the stem that attracts this kind of shortening. Moving on to shortening of inflected present stems, there's two types that I'll talk about today, or two types, I guess, that I've identified. The first type is for first singular subjects only, first singular agreement only, and this is what I call the team type. So this is for verbs that have a present stem vowel short e, where in the case of shortening, the vowel lengthens to e, long e, and the connecting glide, ya, and the short u of the agreement suffix are deleted. So you go from something like teyum to team. And just to see that this is only occurring for the first singular, you can compare forms like toteya and mash teyam. And as far as I'm aware, this type of shortening happens maybe all of the time, at least in the dialects and with the speakers that I've come into contact with. I've not heard teyum in natural speech, but again, maybe native speakers can chime in if I'm wrong about that. So it looks something like this. We have a stem with this sequence, short I followed by the palatal glide ya, and then the o that's shortened to e, and we end up with this pattern. So teyum to team. And other verbs that undergo this type of shortening are Ve to vim, that is I am in the irrealis. Veum to vim, I fall. Varveum to varvim, I'm able to. Zineum to zivim, wash. And videum to vidim, I find. The second type of shortening in inflected present stems is one that occurs for the first singular form and for second and third plural forms. And here it seems like what's targeted is a stem that ends in the pattern here, with the consonant followed by a long vowel, I guess maybe in most situations, perhaps all, and then a C at the end. And here, either the verb stem vowel, so this vowel would be dropped along with the consonant, or the vowel and the agreement suffix is dropped. So in the case of first singular, we have the short o of the agreement ending to be dropped along with the final consonant. So this should be a long vowel here. So instead of them, we get them, basically, for I hit or I give. And in the case of second and third plural, the stem vowel is dropped and the full agreement ending is retained in place. So instead of veit, you get veit, and instead of vein, you get vein. And I should say that for this type of shortening, it also does seem to be rather common. I'm not sure if always, but I'm told that it sounds much more natural to say them instead of them, and much more natural to say date instead of david. So this is what this looks like. For the first singular form, the shortening targets this portion of the verb, and this portion is deleted, and you end up with something like kham from xār-um. For the second plural, this portion, so entirely within the present stem, is targeted. That's deleted, and you end up with something like chet, meaning you all eat. And for the third plural, the same portion is targeted, and you end up with chen instead of charim. So here's a more complete list of verbs that undergo this type of shortening. It's many of the same suspects, except we have the addition now of thou. So instead of thawum, we say tham. Instead of thawit, fate, and so on. And also a couple noteworthy ones here. The verb meaning to say with present stem löv becomes löm for the first singular, but the forms lövet and lövein are used instead of lane and late, as far as I'm aware. And also the verb ken is noteworthy in that it shortens in this way only in negative imperatives. So we have forms like mock, mockate, and mockain, and perhaps even mocked for third singular, I'm told. Right, and last, the shortening of second singular imperatives. So again, second singular imperatives are identical to a bare present stem, that is a present stem without an agreement suffix. So if you have a verb like yīdow with present stem nith, the imperative would be nith as well. And this type of shortening in imperatives also involves the dropping of the final consonant, and importantly involves the shortening of the stem vowel in the case of long stem vowels to its short equivalent based on the correspondences, which I will show in just a minute. So this looks like this. You start with a form like khar with the long vowel and a final consonant. The two final phonemes are targeted, and you end up with kha. So from khar to kha. And here is a more extensive list of this type of verbs. And again, we can see sort of the same suspects. Sao to sa, da to da, parda to parda, and so on. And this one right here, live to lo, will be important in just a minute. So as I mentioned before, certain types of verb shortening provide morphophonological evidence for the way that Shughni vowel phonemes have traditionally been organized. So in particular, verb shortening suggests that the correspondences between long vowels and short vowels are not only phonetic in nature, but also morphophonological. So Shughni has 10 vowel phonemes, 7 of them long and 3 short. So a short a, I, u, and then a long a, I, a, and u, o. And this goes back at least as far as Sokolova 1953, but this particular configuration I took from Edelman and Yusufbekov. And so here's this conceptualization in chart form. So we have this group of vowels up in the left corner, this group of vowels here, and this group of vowels here. And these are generally thought to pattern together. So we have a front group, as it's traditionally been called, where the short vowel E patterns with these long vowels, a back group where the short vowel U patterns with these long vowels, and then a low group where short A and long A pattern together. So this is precisely how vowels have traditionally been categorized in the language. A low group, a non-low group that's front or non-rounded, and then a non-low group that's back or rounded. And I know that my acoustic data from Shughni suggests that this vowel is not a back vowel, but rather a front vowel. So perhaps the feature which unites these two groups is non-rounded and rounded rather than front and back. And so that gives us the correspondences here. And evidence for these types of correspondences has generally been phonetic, acoustic and articulatory in particular. So Sokolova notes that each short vowel can resemble its corresponding long vowel or long vowels in quality, depending on its position in a word. So this is her configuration right here. And on either side, we have the diapason, the range of the short vowels. So short E can range in quality from E all the way down to E, and short U can range in quality from U all the way down to O. And we get the most narrow variant or the highest variant of each of the short vowels, E and U, in open syllables, not word finally. So open syllables where they're followed by another syllable. So for example, in xīdow, we get the highest variant of short E. In a word like mess, we get the middle variant of short E, and then we would find in something like ke, in absolute final position. Notably missing, I would point out, is a variant in which short U resembles the long vowel in quality. And this is a gap that is filled in by verb shortening. So in particular, in cases where verb shortening, where we have a long vowel that becomes shortened, the long vowel invariably shortens to its short counterpart. And this, I believe, provides nice morphophonological evidence for vowel correspondences that supplements the phonetic evidence shown, for instance, by Sokolova. And in one case, importantly, we see that the imperative form live, meaning to say, shortens to lo. So we can see here our missing correspondence between short O and long U. So here are the correspondences that we find. For A and A, we have sao to sa. For long E to short E, parjiv to parje. For long E to short E, zez to ze. And for the non-low rounded group, from U to we have chu to cha. So this is a case of past stem shortening. And then from U to U, we have luv to lo. And so there are still obviously things missing here. One thing, perhaps there is some sort of phonetic correspondence between U and O. And also, I have yet to see morphophonological correspondences between long A and short E and long O and short O, but perhaps someone else out there has something in mind for that. And that is the end of what I have for today. So, kolay b'syar, spasiba za vнимание, and we can open it up, I guess, to discussion now if we still have time.